What we're going to do next is something that I have really been looking forward to for a long time, and that is we're going to hear what the Coast Guard did in Vietnam. And, I mean, I'll be honest, I didn't know they were there, but they were. And our next presenter is also our executive vice president, that being Art Katz. And Art, I sent you his bio, but I would like to just highlight a couple of things from it. He is a graduate of the Coast Guard Academy. He took a crew on a cutter to Vietnam, and I thought, when I read his bio, I thought it was really kind of neat that they went over as a crew, which is, it beats the heck out of going over as an individual replacement and being basically disposable for your first month in country because nobody wanted to know you and you were replacing somebody they liked and all that. So, the idea of training together as a crew and going over and doing their combat as a crew, I thought was a really smart way to do things. I think our own Bob Babcock can attest to that. He did the same sort of thing with a unit he went to Vietnam with, the 4th Infantry Division, and they trained together before they deployed. So that's a good way to do things, and thank goodness that lesson was learned, and the units now that are going to war deploy as units and redeploy as units, and so that's a good thing. The other thing I wanted to add about Art is a member of the Coast Guard Hall of Fame, and that is a peer-elected honor. So this is not, some admiral somewhere decided that he needed somebody with the letter K in his name or something to go be in the Hall of Fame. Art earned it. I'm also glad to see that Art's wife, Carol, and his 3 daughters, and I'm sorry I don't know your names, I should have asked, but I'm glad to see that y'all are here to see what your dad and husband has to say, and y'all can truth select him too, in case he starts to BS us. So, Art, come on up.
Well, thank you all very much for having me. I would like to start by saying I also didn't know the Coast Guard was in Vietnam until I got there. Special welcome certainly to my wife Carol, my daughters Lisa, Laura, and Leslie. They may have to leave early because they are working people, but they are the heart and soul of my life, and I know, like many of you, the reason that we're all here. I'd also like to give a shout out and a thanks to Skip. As I'm apprenticing with him, I'm learning just how much he does for this organization and how much he cares about it. And on top of that, today is not only Pearl Harbor Day, it is also Skip's Purple Heart Day. So Skip. Well, thank you again. As I said, one of the things that was very interesting in preparing the Coast Guard in Vietnam, which is the name of this talk, is that I learned a lot about what the Coast Guard did in Vietnam that I had no idea about ahead of time, and hopefully I can share that with you. My personal role was I was commanding officer of a Coast Guard gunboat, part of a blockade that went all along the coast of Vietnam from the demilitarized zone all the way down to the southernmost portion, which is the Cao Mau Peninsula, and even around to the west side of the coast where it bordered with Cambodia. The Coast Guard motto, if you don't know it, is Semper Paratus, which means always ready. And in fact, in a very short period of time, once 1965 hit, until about 1970, the Coast Guard did so much with so little in Vietnam, which I will shortly be sharing with you. As the needs were perceived, the Coast Guard response was immediate. As a Coast Guard Academy graduate, when I was a cadet, one of the things I learned was that the Coast Guard is the heart and nucleus about which the Navy forms in times of war. Hopefully you will see that there is some small amount of truth to that. In fact, the Coast Guard, which at the time, 1965, was part of the Department of the Treasury, moved under the Department of the Navy, and Coast Guard Squadron 1, which is the greater part of what I was part of, received, among other things, a Navy Unit Commendation Medal for its operations as part of Operation Market Time. And Market Time is coming in just a moment. For those Zoomers who are on, I believe that we'll be screen sharing, so hopefully, and by the way, all Zoomers, thank you for attending, hopefully this will come up. What you're looking at right now is a Coast Guard patrol boat that's an 82-foot WPB. The W stands for Coast Guard, the PB is patrol boat. We'll talk more about that in a minute. The various items that the Coast Guard was involved in Vietnam show right there, and I will be going through each one of those. And if you look at them, some of them, you may not even know what they mean, but hopefully I will share a little light on that. In 1964, 1 year before these duties were thrust upon the Coast Guard was also responsible for ice breaking, believe it or not. The Coast Guard was responsible for something called AMVER, which is the Allied Merchant Vessel Emergency Response, which kept track of cargo ships all over the world. And if a ship somewhere in any ocean encountered some sort of an emergency, the Coast Guard was able to vector the nearest ship, no matter what the nationality was, to rescue it. So those are a couple of things that the Coast Guard did in peacetime that it still did, even though it now had a wartime responsibility. The name of my vessel was WPB 82326. The United States Coast Guard cutter Point Cypress. We had a crew of about 12, and I had a Vietnamese liaison officer aboard, as was earlier mentioned. The crew came together about 3 months before we went to Vietnam, and we did pre-war training in Alameda, in California. I was fortunate enough to go through my initial survival training at the Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center in Pickle Meadows, Nevada. That's at about 12,000 feet of altitude. And because of the timing, we did it in December, over Christmas week. The snow was about, maybe up to the ceiling. It was not the kind of thing that one typically did when preparing for jungle survival, but it did handle the mental side of it. One of the things that I remember is every morning when they would get us up and we'd have to run uphill to the mess hall, before we did that, we did exercises on the roadway. And the exercises, you had about 12 feet of snow on either side. You get out on the road, you were wearing special gloves. The last thing you did was push-ups. Then you took your hands out of the gloves, ran up to the mess hall, and about 8 hours later, when the sun was out in full bloom, somebody would collect all the gloves so you could do it again the next morning. Welcome to the military. One thing that might be a question is, how did that little boat, 82 feet long, get to Vietnam? Well,
Tell you what, I'll be
thank you. All right, as you look at that freighter up there, you see four white blobs. Those are Coast Guard boats. The Coast Guard is typically, in peacetime, the boats are painted white. After they got to Vietnam, they found out that white was not a good color to have on water. And after a few bullets went whizzing past people's ears and fire was taken, they were painted a very sleek gray, which was much better to have, obviously. Okay, and Skip said we just do this. There we go. All right, in terms of speed, as I said, Coast Guard Squadron 1, I was actually part of Division 13. There was Division 11, 12, and 13, and you'll see more about that. But you'll see between the first date up there is the 27th of May. On April 29th, 1965, President Johnson signed the order to put the Coast Guard under the Navy. In very, very, very short order, you can see down to 18 February 1966, the day before my 24th birthday, I was sailing my vessel fully armed, ready to go to Vietnam. And literally when we got there from Subic Bay in the Philippines, I was on station the next day in combat role. I'll get the hang of this very shortly. Okay, So there's the coast of Vietnam, and there's the blockade. Operation Market Time. Why was there a blockade? Well, it turns out that intelligence figured out that the Viet Cong were being supplied by the North Vietnamese via coastal trawlers, fishing vessels disguised, about 100 to 120 feet in length. They would sail down the coast and go into a myriad number of different harbors, or indentations, if you will, in the coast, unload, and then sail back up. And they were not being intercepted. In fact, in looking at the map, right about there, that's An Xuan Province. Between 1961 and 1965, 42 North Vietnamese trawlers successfully unloaded arms and munitions to the Viet Cong in that location, having sailed down the coast from North Vietnam. Each trawler holds roughly, as I said, 100 tons of material, and that's arms and ammunition. So that's right there, that's 4,200 tons, and one trawler's contents was enough, as I'll describe in a short while, was enough to supply a Viet Cong battalion for several months. So think what kind of a hurt that was putting on South Vietnamese and American forces, because nobody was stopping them. The North Vietnamese even had a unit, it was Unit 125, which formally organized the trawlers and where they would go and when they would go and who would meet them when they got there. So you're all saying to yourselves, well, how did they even find out about these fishing trawlers? By accident. In 1965, an Army helicopter was flying along the coast between Nha Trang and Phu Qua or Phu Cang, and passed a place called Vung Ro Bay. And in the middle of the bay, there was a piece of the jungle that was moving from left to right. The Army knew that that didn't make sense. Go Army, absolutely. They checked with all the Vietnamese counterparts and said, no, there's nobody there from our forces. We don't know what that is. The Army called in Air Force. The Air Force shot them up. There was a tremendous secondary explosion, and that was like a big boom and an aha moment, because at that point we knew what had been suspected, or the Navy knew what had been suspected, that the underway replenishment of Viet Cong forces took place by sailing from North Vietnamese ports down the coast, and then there are just a myriad of different places that you could sail a 120-foot fishing trawler into. Okay, in speaking about those trawlers, and I've got to do this way. Let me just take for a moment, and before you do it, as you look at the coast, you can see the way it was divided up and broken down into the 8 different operating areas, with the 9th area being around the corner on the west coast of Vietnam. And then each operating area was broken down into a series of much smaller areas. The concept was 20 miles offshore would be the United States Navy with the big guns and the big ships. Then in the B, C, D areas, the Coast Guard with its 82-foot gunboats, of which there were 26 all told. And then even closer, the PCFs, which were the Navy 50-foot fast, smaller patrol boats. The good news is we made a great team. The bad news is the PCFs were not very good in heavy weather, meaning they would turn over. Therefore, anytime there was a storm, the monsoon season, which was 4.5 months long, the PCFs were not there. I spent personally, and so did most of my counterparts, and just as an aside, my class, Coast Guard Academy, is a very small academy, the smallest of them. My class graduated in '94. 37 of us were in Vietnam. So that's like 40% of my class. We spent a lot of time, particularly in this area down here. Vung Tau is right there. This is Mekong Delta. This is all flat area with a number of rivers. I spent a lot of time in those rivers, and believe it or not, people actually shot at me while I was in them. One of the things that people say when they talk to they say, "You were a gunboat commanding officer? Wow, that's pretty neat." And I would always segue into, think floating target. Once they got that impression, they understood better that it wasn't all, if you will, glory. All right, we're going to go to the next one now. All right, this describes, and I'll just slide right past it. This describes North Vietnamese trawlers, and they were organized. As you can see, they went up to 150 feet. They sailed almost as fast as the Coast Guard boats did, and they could carry, with a crew of about the same size, and I will show you in just a second, they could carry 120 tons worth of arms and munitions. That's a lot. And the best way I can describe it for you is, if you think of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, think of anywhere from 3,000 to 4,000 to 5,000 laborers, each carrying 50 pounds on their back for 3 or more months. That's what one trawler was the equivalent to. So within a period of a year, basically by the end of 1966, that blockade that I just showed you had throttled down the supply lines by sea to the Viet Cong in the south from about 75% of the total supplies they received to less than 10%. And you'll see more as I go along with it. But if you think, once again, about 3,000 to 5,000 individuals, 50 pounds, 3 months, wow, that was really, really a huge impact. Just so you know what a North Vietnamese trawler looked like, aside from the fact that this one was set on fire a couple of times as part of it being captured. 2 of them were captured. They all had their own self-destruction explosive devices set so that if they were confronted and in order to avoid being captured, they would blow the trawlers up, and obviously the arms and ammunition would as well not get to it. That's one. That's the second one. I'm sorry, the pictures are as good as I could find them. But this next one will give you a little idea of the kind of things that were captured. They were mostly Chi-Com, Chinese Communist manufactured weapons. They were anything from AK-47s and ordinary carbines to small machine guns. In some cases, 75 millimeter recoilless rifles, 40 millimeter mortars, and upwards of 500,000 to 1 million rounds of ammunition per ship. So we're talking about a whole lot. They were stopped by a combination of the blockade and air surveillance, which would track them, because once they're in international waters, which is about 12 miles off the coast, you couldn't stop them per se unless there was some kind of suspicious activity. The Coast Guard cutter that I was describing, and I hope we're going to, there's more arms, but actually I'm looking at J. Mark Walker. How do I get behind that chip? How do we get that out of the way, or can we? Okay, I'm going back then. Meet my home for a year. United States Coast Guard. This is one of the sister ships, but we were, as I say, point class vessels. You can see what the crew was. 75 tons with VN armament. That 82-foot gunboat bristled with 5 50 caliber machine guns and an 81 millimeter mortar. And those of you in the Army are probably wondering about the mortar. I'm going to be pleased to tell you that we had the first of its kind ever in the world, a trigger-fired mortar on a gimbal, which could be rotated about 200 degrees, left to right or right to left, and of course elevated up and down with a range of about 4 miles. It could shoot flares, it could fire Willie Peter, white phosphorus, and it could fire high explosives. And it was a mean weapon. And you are looking at a very modest, mean machine. I love my boat, and I love what it could do. The 50 caliber and the mortar are mounted right there, and we are now going to get a little closer look at them. I described this to a couple of you who got to the meeting early, and you looked at it and said, "You got to be kidding me. That's a mortar?" Guys, that's an 81 millimeter mortar. As you can see right there, the gunner is firing the machine gun, but the mortar was used very, very, very effectively. Questions came up like, well, how did you load it? Well, you load it like any other mortar. You just slide the projectile in from the top. However, the firing pin was not exposed. The firing pin had to be actuated with a trigger. So therefore, you could drop the mortar shell down the tube, but you didn't have to fire it. And then, when you pulled the trigger, bingo, it fired. And believe it or not, it really worked. But it was never tried before Vietnam, and I think my boat was the 13th or the 14th boat that was actually outfitted with it. We had a very interesting, or I'll just relate, think about a mortar on land. Basically, it's a tube, right? You drop the shell in, boom, and off it goes. You change the elevation, you move it a little to the right or to the left. This one swings 200 degrees. You didn't want to go further than that because you could blow yourself up. Could rotate up and down to about 80 degrees, but you're firing in a three-dimensional environment which is always moving. Ships on the ocean move. You've all been in a boat probably and seen it goes up. So how do you accurately fire, especially when you're 3 or 4 miles away? And we were doing 1 to 2 gunfire support missions into the coast every month. The answer is, if you think about a pendulum, when a pendulum swings, there is a moment in time when you're standing still. Pendulum goes back, comes back to here, moment in time once again. That's what we had to do. So I had a very, very, very good chief bosun's mate. He was extraordinarily good at just feeling that time when that boat, and when you've been on a boat for 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, you really get to know it pretty well. And he would pull the trigger. I just told him, open fire at will. We did some very, very effective, I like to say, score good guys 1, bad guys -7, -12, -20. It worked out very, very well. The other thing about the Coast Guard cutters was they're steel-hulled. They are aluminum superstructures. So let me just slide back again. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So this is a steel hull and an aluminum superstructure. It was built that way for search and rescue. The pilot house up there, that's where the commanding officer or whoever was driving the boat stood. During Vietnam, the commanding officer had a lot of responsibilities when you went to general quarters, because there were only 12 of us and there were 5 machine guns. So if you think about 2 people per machine gun, that's 10. Number 11 is the commanding officer. Number 12 is the executive officer who was there in case the commanding officer got hurt or got scared. When you're 15 feet above the waterline and you have about 8 feet of aluminum, how many of you have opened a Diet Coke can? Okay, not much stops it, right? There were times when after a gunfight, we would look at our aluminum and you would see a 7.62 round would go in on side 1 like this, and would come out side 3 or side 6 like that, because it just mushroomed and just right through the aluminum. But getting to the commanding officer, he stood up there. Above his head was a searchlight, which was hand operated. Night operations, very, very useful. Think about what they might be shooting at if the searchlight is there, okay? I had on sound-powered phones, because that's how I communicated with all the gun stations on general quarters, but only one ear covered because I also had to communicate with headquarters if they bothered me while we were in a combat situation. Had to watch the fathometer, had to watch the radar, had to drive the steering wheel, had control of both the engines, and had all the engine auxiliary watch buttons in case we took a hit through there. But generally speaking, the steel hulls did pretty well for us. Standing 15 feet above the waterline does give you a very good view, and it makes you an excellent target. From 1965 to 1972, when Operation Market Time went into effect, 50 trawlers were detected. Of those, 9 were destroyed, 2 were captured. You saw pictures of the 2 that were captured, and 39 aborted, meaning they knew that they were in trouble, they knew that they had been spotted, and they turned around and went back to North Vietnam. And I'll show you a chart of that a little bit later, that just all along the coast, all different places. But we really did a very good job of stopping them, and I am most proud to say, am I doing that right?
Yeah. Where do you want to go?
No, wait, hang on, thank you very much. But Chip told me I had 2 hours with you. I'll move along as quickly as I can. Okay. All right. This is the other part of Operation Market Time. Boarding or bringing along, in most cases, just poor fishermen trying to make a living in sampans or junks that were anywhere from, that's about 30 feet long to about 70 feet long. These people they're just trying to eke out a living. But among them, every so often, there would be contraband. There would be money being smuggled in so that the Viet Cong had more cash and more finances, and occasionally a North Vietnamese political officer trying to get in down the coast. So this went on average, we detected 6 a day on my boat. We boarded 5 a day on my boat. Do you think a .50 caliber is very effective when they're right alongside of you? Not at all. So the only thing that we had was small arms weapons, and part of my job was to make sure that the crew was always on its toes. And I'm telling you, on average 5 a day, but during the monsoon, they weren't out there. So for 4 months out of the year, basically, we saw very little. And if we saw something, we knew it was going to be something bad. But just think about if 2 of those gentlemen with the conical hats on had hand grenades behind their back and just pulled the pin and lobbed it up, we would be in very big trouble. So I had to make sure that every single time, and I was on deck for every single, that was standing orders. You wake me, you're looking at somebody who for a year basically slept no more than 2 hours at a time, but it was a good 2 hours. Anytime we had a contact and we were going to bring side, that's what we had to deal with. And I had to make sure that the crew was on top. Of course, routine leads to boredom, leads to inattention, leads to potential disaster. That was part of what I had to do. Okay. Chip, I'm having a little problem with this damn thing. Please. It's over here, right? I'm sorry, but technically, I'm seeing myself on here instead of seeing the slides, which makes it a little bit more challenging. Back here. You know, I'm going to skip that one. Yeah, well, let's go there. All right, Coast Guard Squadron 1, statistics. 26 WPBs, 3,000 in crew. In 5 years there, our vessels sailed, as you can see, and I was going to read this, but I understand that the Zoomers can see this as well, so it's pretty well self-explanatory, but you can see that 4,400 and some odd naval gunfire support missions. The ratio of Coast Guard and wounded in action or killed in action versus Viet Cong wounded or killed in action, we really did pretty well. When I'm asked what I'm most proud of for my time in Vietnam, it's the fact that on my boat, my crew, nobody was killed in action, nobody was wounded in action. We saw one major battle, one major big shoot 'em up with the bad guys' boats every 2 months. The odds were that we could have gotten hurt, but because we did things pretty well, I'd like to say we weren't. One of the things that I didn't mention is when we were in Subic Bay and the boats came off and we put the armament on them, etc., one of the things that I insisted, and I had no idea how propitious it turned out to be, I trained my crew at night in pitch darkness. We had to go to general quarters. We had to be able to find everything in pitch darkness. And I will tell you, as most of us know, most of Vietnam in the 1960s was not lighted. And if you were on a boat and you had a light, that was like shoot here. No lights made it a whole lot better, and the only thing that they could shoot at was the muzzle flashes from our guns. I think we pressed for time?
Oh, yeah, we are.
Okay, we're pressed for time, so I'll skip a couple of things, and that's fine. You can see the statistics, which we're very proud of. Let me just quickly get to, I'll use you. Next thing, aids to navigation. Most people are not aware that Vietnam, at the time that the Navy got there, did not have any aids to navigation to speak of. The whole country had 9 buoys. Most of you know what buoys are. They had some unlighted lighthouses or unmanned lighthouses. Within the first year that the Coast Guard was called, over 100 buoys were put in place, primarily in the most important areas to need navigation. Vietnam, before the war, had the biggest thing they had was maybe a 70-foot junk. It was very much of a coastal trade. Now you have these behemoth freighters, cargo ships, etc., coming in, and the whole port had to be designed, aids to navigation had to be put in place. This is a Coast Guard cutter Blackthorn. It is an aids to navigation vessel which placed over 100 buoys on the waterways to Saigon, the waterways to Cam Bay, the waterways to Da Nang, and with more time, lesser vessels. Okay, next one. That is a land-based aid to navigation. The guy standing on top or sitting on top is fixing it. He is one of the Coast Guard repairmen who flew 2,000 to 3,000 miles per month, constantly taking care of the fact that, among other things, those were excellent shooting targets. People used them for target shooting. They were vandalized constantly. The wire was taken, etc. The sensors would stop working, etc., etc. So that's another aspect of what we did that went on continuously. All right, the next one. Any of you ever heard of LORAN? If you have, please raise your hand. Okay, a fair amount. For those who don't know, LORAN is an acronym for Long Range Aids to Navigation. It is phenomenal in the sense that LORAN-C, which was the type that was put in at the time, which was 1967, had a range of almost 1,400 miles and an accuracy of within 50 feet. You had a master station, a slave station. The master station sent out a micropulse on a certain frequency. That pulse went out 1,400 miles. It hit a slave station. It sent out a pulse on a different frequency. Where those two intersected, which was where your receiver was, told you where you were within 50 feet. Prior to those stations being built, and they were built in 8.5 months in 4 different locations, doesn't matter where they are, but 3 are in Thailand, and the 4th one is just off the southern tip of Vietnam on Con Son Island. It was done in 8.5 months, from picking the site locations, clearing the land in dense jungle, bringing in all the equipment, erecting a LORAN antenna. Is 625 feet high, more than 2 football fields in height, and guy wires held it in place. This was all done within 8.5 months by a crew of about 20 Coast Guardsmen with native contractors. They had to deal with, obviously, jungle conditions, poisonous snakes, tigers, whatever you want to think of, in far-flung places where there really wasn't much to put them in place, but the locations were critical to the whole navigational capability. Subsequent to those 4 being put in, the Air Force asked for a 5th one to be put in, closer to North Vietnam, because they were bombing North Vietnam at a much higher level, and that was put in right there at Tay Nan. I'm sorry, bingo, right there. So within another 6 months, a 5th one was put in. Another thing that I learned, besides the fact that we put in LORAN stations, was that the LORAN stations were responsible for saving the lives of innumerable downed Air Force pilots, because they could be used, they could locate where the pilots were within 50 feet, and the rescue helicopters, which is where we're going next, could then get to the pilots. That, for many of you who know it, that's a Jolly Green Giant. There was something called the 37th Air Force Rescue and Recovery Squadron. That squadron called in 1967 the Coast Guard and said, hey, we have very limited experience with rescue and recovery in the jungle, and even less at sea. We want your help. Within 6 months' time, 80 Coast Guard airmen were volunteered themselves, I should say. 11 were actually selected, including one of my classmates. They went to Vietnam with 3 of those helicopters and 2 fixed-wing aircraft. To give you an example of what the Coast Guard Flyers did, Lieutenant Jack Richier, which was one of the first group of 8, in his first 2 months in Vietnam, he rescued 13 downed pilots as the pilot of one of those helicopters. He died trying to rescue number 14 and 15. The other milestone I'll tell you about Coast Guard pilots is, in the air rescue world, rescuing 500 downed pilots is a huge milestone. Pilots rescued number 498, 499, and 500 all were accomplished by the Coast Guard pilots that were on loan, if you will, to the Air Force. Okay, let me just switch along so I'm moving along here. We got aids to navigation, we got Loran, we've got downed pilot rescue. The last thing I'll talk about is port security. Not something that very many people think about. But, okay. See those holes? That merchant vessel was a very good target for a Viet Cong 75mm recoilless rifle. Fortunately, it didn't blow up in the middle of the ship. But that happened on an ongoing basis. When you think about the flow of arms, ammunition, napalm, etc., that constantly went into the ports of Saigon, Cam Ranh Bay, Da Nang, etc., this was a big deal. And the Army was initially responsible for it, but that was not what I would call their strong suit. They asked for the Coast Guard to come in, and particularly what we called ELDs, explosive loading detachments. When you're taking something like napalm off a ship, and let me give you a great example. Prior to that, the Vietnamese stevedores, if you will, they used trucks, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the methods they employed for unloading 40mm weapons, arms, was you swing the pallets onto the back of the truck, you drive the truck in reverse as fast as you can, you slam on the brakes, and hopefully the pallets slide off and they hit the ground. This is for real. That's what was happening at the time. On top of that, there was no security, no gates around the port areas. Anybody could walk in and walk out. It was a difficult time. The explosive loading detachment people, in very short order, not only made sure that there was, if you think about this, while you're unloading, you want to make sure that you know how to, if let's say an attack happens, is the ship ready to get underway? Emergency, get the hell out of here kind of thing. What are you going to do if something explodes or something catches on fire? Do you have the adequate fire hoses? Do you have the adequate people to man them? Do they know how to man them? Is all the protocol in place? And then flip that over. Once you store all this stuff, do you just put it all together, which is what was happening with the most highly explosive, the inflammables, in the middle with arms all around them? Or do you leave pathways so that the firefighting and explosive fighting details can get to them? All of this was part of the port security, I'll call it expertise, that the Coast Guard had, which they brought to Vietnam and to the war effort. And the good thing about it is, there never was a truly disastrous explosion of that type in those areas that the Coast Guard explosive loading device detachments were in charge. There were, it is said to be, several hundred near misses. I know we're all veterans, so near misses are a good thing. And the last thing, very, very quickly, is merchant marine supervision. In peacetime, the Coast Guard is responsible for merchant marine safety. You go on a cruise ship, the Coast Guard is responsible for making sure that that ship is prepared. Well, there were innumerable merchant vessels in Vietnam, some of them waiting 2 months to be unloaded. Most of the sailors, the merchant marine seamen, were good guys doing what they were supposed to do, but there was a 2% to 3% incident rate. Some of them went AWOL. They knew their ship was going to be there for 2 months. Hey, I think I'll spend a month and a half in the dark side of Saigon or wherever it might be. And On the wall behind those guys, those are improvised weapons that certain number of nefarious merchant seamen who were captured were found to be using. The merchant marine captains did not have much authority over their sailors. And one of the things that the Coast Guard did was got together with the Army provost marshals who were responsible for each of the ports, worked with the embassy, and had an act enacted that put all merchant seamen who were involved in the war effort in the war zone under the UCMJ. At that point, problems with merchant seamen dropped dramatically. I think I've taken enough of your time. I truly appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. As I learn more about the Coast Guard, I hope you did too. And questions and answers, thank you all very, very much for very attentive faces. Nobody is asleep, and if I ran over in time, I very much apologize. I really did squeeze it down. I had a bunch of really good jokes to tell you. We'll get them another time. Thank you.
Questions?
Yes.
Questions?
Can I ask one?
Sure.
I want you to tell about, I don't know if it happened more than once or not, where you actually went in an inland waterway and had to wait for the tide. Now, I don't know how much that boat that you were on, how much draft it was, but
5.5 feet. Okay, I'll be glad to. Thanks. It's a good question.
So, yeah, repeat the question.
All right, the question is, in the rivers, and I didn't spend a lot of time talking about time in the rivers, John is aware of a specific gun battle that I was involved with, which I can briefly relate to you. The tide in Vietnam runs about 10 feet per tidal change. That is, if you will, well, that's about 8 feet. If I could dunk, it would be, you'd get an idea. So it's about a foot an hour that it changes, which means that there's a 7 to 8 knot current when the tide is running at full speed. In June of 1966, intelligence reports said that the Viet Cong, let me back up a second, the Mekong River Delta, which is that whole area that I showed you in the southern part of the country, is interlaced with canals. It's that part of the country is alluvial, it's flat, interlaced with canals, and that was the transportation route. They didn't have a lot of roads, but they had canals. And the Viet Cong were supplying, if this is the Delta, all through here, they were supplying their infrastructure by boats. We got word that they were moving major amounts of arms and ammunition. I did what many would say was not the brightest thing in the world, and I said, I can do something about that. Would you let me? And Big Brother said, yes, go ahead. I picked an evening at low tide, 8 p.m., had to get through the mouth of the Delta. I went into the Cochin River, which is one of 5 major rivers of the Mekong River Delta. My boat takes 5.5 feet of water. I knew that if I went in at 8 o'clock at night, at which time it was already dark, I had about 7 or 8 hours where I would have more water than the minimum amount, meaning because the tide was coming in and hadn't gone out that far. I grew up on the South Shore of Long Island. I did a lot of fishing, drove around in rowboats. I was pretty good at reading the flow of the water and knowing where I was going. We got in. We went upstream about 4 miles, picked a point where the incoming tide was offset by the outgoing river current, and just sat and drifted, started radar surveillance. About an hour later, 3 really big junks, about 70 feet in size, came out of one of called Raksha Canal, heading from east to west. We knew they didn't belong there. We waited until they were at about mid-river, so they had to go the furthest to get away from us. If they managed to get away from us, started the engines, and they were in an arrowhead formation. 1 junk here, 2 junks behind them. I drove my boat in between the 3, so all 550 caliber machine guns were fired at the same time on all 3 of the targets. One of them blew up with a secondary explosion that literally knocked some of my gunners off their feet. We sank the second one. I saw bodies going through the air. We think we got the third one because we couldn't find it on radar, but in the hullabaloo of everything, we don't know whether we got the third one for sure or not, but we know we put a hurt on them. We started in total darkness, we left in total darkness, and getting out was much easier than getting in. And to this day, unless, I guess now it's all declassified, they don't know what hit them. They have no idea. And we did it a couple more times, different times. Long-winded answer, John, but thank you. Other questions? No. That's what we were there for, right? Other questions? Yes, sir. Did we ever run aground? I didn't, but I can probably show you pictures of others that did. If the charts that we were given when we got to Vietnam to use were from the period of 1890 to 1895. They were in French, and any of you who know anything about river deltas, they move. So I had a chart that said that the river was over here, but I'm looking at the river and it's over there. So yes, some of the boats did run aground, and if you ran aground, and it was really a mud, because it wasn't a hard bottom, but rather a soft bottom, then you were stuck where you were until the tide did a whole swing of about 8 or 9 hours, and at that point, potentially you were at the mercy of somebody else. Plus you had to shut down, because your engines are water cooled, and you had to shut down the engines in order to make sure that you didn't overheat, and if you overheated, then you were there for as long as, who knows, until somebody came. Plus it's very embarrassing. One doesn't like to be aground. It's not good for a commanding officer's reputation. Next question. Okay, if no further questions, once again, thank you very much. It's a pleasure. I'm honored to be here.